Ça marche? Oui, parfait. Bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous donc, pour ce débat. La démocratie est-elle soluble dans l'Internet? Qu'est-ce que nous font les médias sociaux? Comment on les appelle? Comment est-ce que l'usage des données affecte le débat politique? Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire de tout ça? Comment est-ce qu'on peut en sortir aussi? C'est ce qu'on verra dans quelques instants. Mais pour commencer, le réalisateur et journaliste Thomas Huchon va s'exprimer pendant quelques minutes. C'est donc lui qui signe ce Unfair Game, pas franchement rassurant.
Bien, bonsoir à tous. Déjà, je tiens personnellement à vous remercier d'être tous présents, à remercier le festival d'avoir choisi de projeter ce film. Et vous dire mon émotion personnelle, c'est la première projection publique de ce documentaire qui est sorti en juin 2017 sur la plateforme Spicy, qui est un nouveau média qui fait du documentaire et de l'information uniquement en vidéo. Je crois qu'au tout début, quand on commence une enquête, on ne sait jamais très bien là où ça va nous mener. Il se trouve que dans cette enquête-là, je ne pensais pas du tout découvrir l'existence de telles techniques de manipulation de l'opinion. Je n'avais pas du tout conscience de ça. Et je crois que si j'avais qu'un seul souhait, c'est peut-être que ce film et que tous les gens qui ont participé à faire ce film, moi je suis là tout seul aujourd'hui devant vous, mais il y a beaucoup de gens qui travaillent pour faire un film, et il n'y a pas que les techniciens qui le font, il y a aussi tous ceux qui acceptent de prendre du temps pour nous expliquer les problématiques. Mais si je pouvais peut-être formuler un souhait ce soir, avant de laisser la place à ce débat qui, je vous le garantis, va être fascinant, c'est que on oublie trop souvent que quand on est dans l'univers d'Internet, qui est un univers virtuel, eh bien cet univers peut devenir réel. On oublie que quand on utilise des services gratuits, eh bien le produit, c'est nous. Et on a bien conscience que des techniques marketing sont utilisées dans cet esprit-là. Je ne crois pas qu'on avait mesuré qu'on pouvait s'en servir de manière politique. Et je crois que ça doit être peut-être pas un message systématiquement négatif. Bien entendu qu'il faut une prise de conscience et qu'il faut changer les choses pour pas que ces techniques puissent être utilisées à l'avenir. Mais je ne voudrais pas que ce film soit un film pessimiste. Je crois que la démocratie, c'est quelque chose qu'il faut défendre tous les jours. C'est un processus qu'on a l'impression de vivre et qui est là pour toujours. Mais en fait, non. Il faut le défendre. Il faut le défendre face à toutes les bouleversations qu'elle peut subir. La technologie, comme l'explique très bien Carole Cadwalader dans le film, eh bien, c'est après la musique, après le cinéma, après les médias, la nouvelle industrie, comme elle dit, qui a été disruptée par l'univers de la technologie. La politique, c'est la seule chose que nous avons tous en commun. Et je crois qu'il faut qu'on le conserve de cette manière-là, il faut qu'on le protège. J'espère que ce film aura levé un voile pour vous, qui vous aura intéressé. Et peut-être que si vous avez des questions à la fin, je pourrai répondre. Je laisse la place aux panélistes.
Merci beaucoup Thomas. On aura évidemment le temps, on prendra le temps de discuter de tout ça, et avec les panélistes, et avec Thomas Huchon, et avec Sylvain Gisler d'Opération Libéraux qui nous rejoindra aussi à la fin. Merci beaucoup. Je vais demander donc à nos 3 intervenants de me rejoindre. Hop, je vais plutôt me mettre là. Donc par ordre d'apparition, Paul-Olivier Dehaye, mathématicien, cofondateur de personaldata.io, qui est un service qui vise à aider les internautes à reprendre le contrôle de leurs données. Autant dire qu'il y a du pain sur la planche. Evgeny Morozov, chercheur, essayiste, auteur de The Net Delusion, qui, à ma connaissance, n'a pas eu de traduction française. Non, il n'est pas traduit, mais qui abordait la question de l'usage des nouvelles technologies dans les régimes autoritaires et qui était un contrepoint au discours techno-optimiste de l'époque, hein, pour résumer, et également auteur d'un ouvrage plus récent qui, lui, a été traduit en français et qui s'appelle « Pour tout résoudre, cliquez ici ». Et puis enfin, Ivan Krastev, politologue, chercheur à l'Institut des sciences humaines de Vienne et directeur du Center for Liberal Strategies de Sofia. Je vais commencer en vous demandant peut-être ce que vous inspire ce documentaire, et ce que vous inspire cet écosystème Mercer, hein, si on peut dire, qui s'appuie à la fois sur un média, ça s'est beaucoup vu, hein, le rôle de Breitbart News, mais qui s'appuie aussi donc, sur cette entreprise Cambridge Analytica qui s'est fait une spécialité du micro-ciblage électoral. On va peut-être commencer par vous, Ivan Krastev.
Normally people start with me because I'm the least knowledgeable about technology. But let's tell you a story. It's a very interesting film, and of course there is a lot of stories to talk about technology. But let's tell you a story about fake news, which is slightly older. In 1924, 1 week before the parliamentary elections in Great Britain, one of the most important conservative tabloids published a letter which was basically allegedly the letter of the leader of the Communist International, Zinoviev. And this was basically a message to the communists within the Labour Party. A week later, you have the elections, and basically, the Labour Party lost. And Labour Party was sure that because of this fake and news, they lost the elections. Years later, a very famous British historian, A.P. Taylor, showed that it was not because of the Zinoviev letter that they lost these elections, but it was because of the Zinoviev letter that they lost the next elections, because they never understood why they really lost. And here's my story, and this is the question that I want to ask. Mercer was very much a story about technology and how technology worked. There was a micro-targeting on the other side, too. And from this point of view, if you go back to 2012, you're going to read a book which was called Victory Lap, which was very positive, and it was about something very similar. And it was very much how micro-targeting and going with the small constituencies and basically going exactly in a very key states that matters decided Obama's elections. So from this point of view, what I do believe is very important is not to go in a simple conspiracy theory, that this was the guy who did it. Obviously, something is happening in politics in general. Obviously, technology is changing this for everybody. And from this point of view, if we basically believe that it was the algorithm that solved the elections, we can end up in the position of basically the Labour Party in Britain.
C'est effectivement une vraie question, hein. Quel est l'impact exact de ces technologies dans le résultat d'une élection? C'est extrêmement difficile à mesurer. Evgeny Morozov, vous en pensez quoi, vous, de tout ça? Justement, à votre sens, est-ce que effectivement ça a pu jouer un rôle? Si oui, lequel? Ou est-ce qu'il y avait aussi peut-être des causes sociales plus profondes? Parce que l'électorat trumpiste n'est pas non plus sorti de terre soudainement.
Je dois m'excuser, mais je vais m'exprimer en anglais parce que c'est un peu plus simple pour moi. I think there are three big phenomena in this film that we have seen that very often in public analysis are lumped together under the label of fake news and many similar terms. One is clearly micro-targeting, based on a lot of data that is obtained legally or illegally and on which much of our economy now works. I think everybody does it. Businesses do it, Pentagon does it, State Department does it, political parties do it. You must be mad not to be doing it if you're participating in a political campaign now. To what extent it's legal and illegal under American and European law, we can debate, but I think there is no point pointing finger at Trump and saying that you've done it, nobody else does it. Everybody does it. Then there is a second layer, and that second layer has to do with a lot of journalistic outlets that, while reporting on politicians who cut corners in making their political statements, cut corners as well. So Breitbart News, to some extent, would fall into that category. So the two examples that open the film, one, I think most of them were from Breitbart. One of them reported on Trump saying that 800,000 illegal immigrants voted in the election and it changed the outcome. And the other one said that research claims that Hillary Clinton is engaged in criminal behavior, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, those are not fake news by my definition of fake news, because they are actually truthfully reporting on what was said by Trump on the one hand and by some research on the other. Now, of course, we can say that any journalist with ethics working for an ethical, investigative journalistic outlet would also add that what Trump has said, which he did, was not actually accurate, and that did not happen. And that what research claims about Hillary Clinton is actually incorrect, as most other studies show. Now, Bright, being mostly an opinion site, doesn't go through the trouble of pointing that out, so they just present it as reality. But they do say Trump said it, studies show. It's not Breitbart's own news, right? So that's the second category. This is basically journalism twisting some ethical norms and cutting some corners, in part because politicians cut corners as well. And I think many outlets do it. Trump is not solely responsible for it. There are outlets on left and right, pro-immigration, against immigration, pro-abortion, against abortion, who do that. I would not ascribe it just to the right-wing people. And then there is the third category, which is the outright manufacturing of fake news, which are stories that are intentionally manufactured to provide erroneous information in order to gain traffic and monetize it through advertising. And political parties and political movements have discovered that this is happening, and they have taken advantage of that infrastructure to some extent. A lot of them on the right tap into it. I would argue that if you look hard enough, you would probably find some outlets on the left doing it, not to the same extent. Having said that, I think we do ourselves a very big disservice if we lump all those three phenomena together and we try to come up with a narrative that essentially does not see differences between them. Because if you analyze them separately, analytically, you will see that for some of them, as I've said, a lot of actors are involved in them. It's not specific to Breitbart, not specific to Mercer, not specific to Trump. In some of them, these guys have pioneered certain things, but across the board, you know, I'm very reluctant to acknowledge that something unique is happening and exceptional is happening, because most of those techniques have been used for decades. Yes, it's true that now they have been honed with a lot of personal data that has been collected, but I am very reluctant to point the finger to the Mercers and say that they are de facto responsible for Trump's victory, because ultimately, I just don't see that as an innovation on the one hand, and B, as an innovation that we should be weighing above all the other factors that have contributed to Trump's victory. Now, do I hate big tech? Do I think they pose a big problem? Do I think there are a lot of problems related to data? Yes. I'm just not convinced by a narrative that refuses to draw those analytical distinctions to the extent where I think they should be drawn.
Alors, c'est Paul-Olivier Dehaye. Qu'est-ce qu'il y a finalement de particulier dans le travail que fait Cambridge Analytica? Ivan Krastev disait tout à l'heure, effectivement, le micro-ciblage électoral, c'est quelque chose, y compris qui a été utilisé par Obama. On l'a vu d'ailleurs arriver en France. Moi, je me souviens, j'avais travaillé sur l'apparition de la fameuse plateforme Nation Builder, que tous les politiques français s'accaparaient, de Jean-Luc Mélenchon à François Fillon, et qui visait précisément à faire ça, hein, c'est-à-dire à affiner l'électorat, le découper finalement en petits morceaux pour être plus efficace. Qu'est-ce qu'il y a de particulier dans ce que fait Cambridge Analytica et en quoi est-ce que c'est un problème de votre point de vue?
Alors, particulier, il y a plusieurs entreprises qui font des choses similaires. Si on veut comparer à ce qui se faisait en 2008, en 2012 avec Obama, effectivement, l'échelle à laquelle ça se fait est beaucoup plus grande. Donc, il y a apparemment, Cambridge Analytica avait 58 millions de profils américains sur Facebook. Donc, c'est vraiment une nouvelle échelle de données, une nouvelle échelle de précision. Il y a aussi un autre aspect sur la transparence qui est que, au fur et à mesure que nos outils s'améliorent, on n'a plus besoin des grosses équipes de campagne au niveau technique pour faire du ciblage précis. Donc l'équipe de campagne de Trump était extrêmement réduite. Il consistait de quelques personnes, de 6 personnes de Cambridge Analytica, par exemple, dans les bureaux de campagne de Trump. Donc ça n'encourage pas la transparence sur tout le processus démocratique. Je suis d'accord avec... donc une autre manière de voir la campagne électorale américaine, c'est de voir ça comme un échec des personnes du côté de Clinton qui faisaient exactement la même chose. Donc ça, c'est tout à fait vrai. Mais sur la différence, je pense qu'il y a un argument ou un élément qui est différent et qui est très peu souligné, c'est l'interaction entre le ciblage publicitaire et les mécanismes d'amplification des plateformes elles-mêmes. Donc c'est le rôle que Facebook finit par jouer, donc pour prendre un exemple, Facebook finit par jouer pour amplifier le ciblage, pour le rendre plus précis et pour aussi finalement privilégier certains candidats plutôt que d'autres, de par les mécanismes de pricing, des publicités, etc., encourager les candidats qui génèrent un certain type d'engagement autour des contenus qui vont pousser dans une campagne électorale, des comportements plus primitifs, plus instinctifs autour du partage de contenu, qui n'encouragent pas forcément la réflexion, qui n'encouragent pas forcément un débat démocratique, mais plus l'impulsion, en gros. Parce que ça nous maintient sur les plateformes, ce qui est dans leur intérêt commercial, et c'est évidemment ça qu'ils cherchent à optimiser. Donc il y a ce rôle, ce mécanisme de feedback qui est extrêmement important entre le ciblage et les intérêts des plateformes elles-mêmes. Et ça, je pense que c'est vraiment nouveau, de par l'échelle, je présente d'habitude ça comme un stress test, un test de stress sur les plateformes qui a lieu tous les 4 ans. Et ici, c'était à une échelle qui était différente d'avant.
Oui, je crois avoir vu passer récemment sur Slate, je crois, un article dont le titre était le Facebook a été utilisé tel que ça devait finalement être utilisé. Evgeny Morozov, est-ce qu'on a là une espèce de démonstration effectivement de plus en plus claire que ces gros silos, ces grandes plateformes construites sur l'exploitation des données personnelles ont des mécanismes technologiques qui peuvent être utilisés à toutes les fins possibles, y compris l'influence politique, mais comme vous le disiez, tout comme dans des perspectives purement commerciales?
Well, I mean, look, again, we should not minimize potential harm and damage of the ecosystem that has emerged heavily underpinned by this big new media giants like Facebook and Google. Not necessarily in the case of this election, where I personally don't think they have played such a big role as a lot of media make it out to be. But in general, yes, there are a lot of very negative effects with regards to discussions about immigration, religion, tolerance, and so forth. I mean, it's clear that right now we're operating in a very different media environment where it's much easier for certain xenophobic populist messages to travel. And the reason why it's so easy for those messages to travel is because the ecosystem favors the speed with which that information travels, and it's done very cheaply, and there are incentives built into it because the companies that control the platforms are interested in those messages propagating because this is how they monetize activity on their networks. So yes, down the road, we are looking at a lot of fringe forces hijacking debates with regards to climate change, with regards to many other important issues. I do not want to minimize the risks of this ecosystem. I just think that we have to be a little bit more realistic in assessing what has happened now, because what has happened has, the background of 50, 70 or more years of heavy manipulation of how the US public works through all sorts of media, all sorts of engineering, all sorts of manipulation. I mean, it has to be seen in that context. In context of everything else we have seen in how US elections are run, I can't really say that this election was an outlier. I mean, the US elections have traditionally been a source of great innovation, we can call it of the evil sort, perhaps, but has been a source of great innovation in terms of campaigning, targeting, propaganda, and so forth. Most elections have been like that. That's the reason why American political consultants then go around the world and consult with European political leaders and others how to run the referenda. So who goes to Italy to advise on the referenda organized by Renzi in 2006? It's Jim Messina, who is very much embedded with the traditional political parties in the United States. So all of that we know very well. So to present Robert Mercer, who comes out of the hedge fund industry, as the person who suddenly cracked the US electoral system and understood how everything works by linking personal data from Facebook to how people decide to vote, I just find it, it's an interesting theory. I just find it a little bit hard to believe in that there is much more to the American electoral system that we probably realize if we just focus on how information propagates through social networks.
If I may, so one originality compared to before any other campaign is how lean the Trump campaign was, in the sense that it wasn't hiring political scientists, it wasn't hiring political consultants to advise on what message to push or anything like it.
They were not expecting to win.
Well, they were trying to win at some point, right? They were trying, around the summer 2016, they were trying to, but they ended up spending all their money essentially on Facebook ads that were micro-targeted and all those things. They were pretty confident that they didn't build a ground game in the classical sense.
But just one little thing, but as you know, with Trump, everything is about money laundering in one way or another. So, when you have an operation which essentially has the Mercer family owning all the other companies and running Trump's campaign, it would make perfect sense for them to hire their own company to run their own electoral campaign because they were expecting for them not to win, and at least the money would stay within the Mercer empire. It's a perfectly reasonable theory which for some reason we are not exploring.
Alors, je vais vous donner la parole, Ivan Krastev, mais avant ça, on a normalement en ligne justement avec nous une des personnes qui a enquêté sur Robert Mercer, c'est Carole Cadwallader, qu'on doit avoir par Skype. Ah, ça y est. Bonjour.
Hello, hi, hello from London.
Merci beaucoup de nous rejoindre. Alors, vous arrivez pour le coup au bon moment parce qu'il y a un débat entre nos intervenants sur la spécificité finalement de l'écosystème Mercer sur lequel vous avez enquêté de Cambridge Analytica. Est-ce que finalement c'est tellement nouveau? Est-ce que c'est tellement spécifique à Trump? Est-ce que ça suffit à expliquer sa victoire? Je vais forcément vous demander votre point de vue, puisque c'est votre sujet d'enquête depuis plusieurs mois maintenant.
Hello, hi, thanks very much for having me first of all, and congratulations to Thomas, who's done such a tremendous job in following the story from, right from the start, really. So I sort of feel that I'm just not the right person to answer that question, because there are people out there who know far more about the American political system than I do. But the thing I suppose I'd answer to the debate we were just having just then is the fact that it's just so difficult to know quite what the Trump campaign did with data and what was special about it, because we've just got no access to knowing what went on behind Facebook's closed walls. And that's the thing which sort of just strikes me listening to the very interesting debate that you're having there. That's the unknown factor in all of this. Was there something different going on? Was the platform being used in a very different way than has been used in other elections? I mean, we know that there's things which have been hinted at about that in Robert Mueller's indictments, which were unsealed last month. He's certainly pointing the finger to things going on Facebook and other social media platforms, and that's I guess that the angle that I'm coming at it is just that we at the moment we just don't have enough information, and that's what I've been sort of trying to get at is we need that transparency. We need Facebook. We need more from them. We need more from the other social media platforms.
Ivan Krastev, vous vouliez intervenir?
For me, it's very important because we see this very interesting film. There was also this very popular book on Fire and Fury on Trump. And these are two different images. On one, you have a totally chaotic candidate and personality, which we also see every day tweeting something here and there. Here you see totally strategic move. You see the most disciplined campaign ever. You have this micro-targeting. These two things does not go easily together. And I'm much more ready to believe that you have a candidate which was not easy to be perceived as strategic, as kind of a Mercer product, because I don't believe that he has the level of self-control, so anybody can control him. And from this point of view, it's quite important. We have an elections that ended not in the way every one of us expected. And unfortunately, I do believe this election result is going to have a very negative impact for the future. But then we started to look for the secret factor. And this is why I was basically so kind of cautious to buy this story. We tried to find something which is very technological, which is not political, to explain why did it happen. I'm not also ready to buy this easily, because for the same time we see three things that are basic trends. One is much more psychology than sociology, for sure. Secondly, we have big data, which starts to work, and to be honest, talking about technology and democracy, if you see how the Chinese are using big data in order to govern, to be honest, what Mercer is doing is not so pioneering. And thirdly, I do believe that this type of a problem is allowing us to also look back at certain things that we probably don't know about how democracy works. Because there is a famous book called Democracy for Realists by two of the leading American political scientists. And they're showing two things which for me is very important. Normally we believe that democracy is about representation. So people have their views, they have their issues, they have their positions, and they go to the candidate which is close to them. On the basis of basically all the data that they have for the last 100 years of the American democracy, they show that normally people do not have position on most of the issues that are discussed. As a result of it, it's very much identity politics. 30 years ago, when abortion was not a major issue in the American politics, basically the Democrat man and Republican voters man have a most similar position on abortion. When it became a major political issue splitting the parties, it appeared that basically they went in the total extremes. It's very much the political parties that are creating. Every type of a vote is an identity politics in one way or the other. And I do believe that all these technology stories should also try to help us understand how the nature of the identity politics is helping now, when through Facebook it's much easier to create this ecosystem in which you basically only talk to people who share your opinions. In a certain way, I find this much more problematic than simply micro-targeting. And secondly, that nobody is interested to persuade anybody anymore. If normally, I always believe that if there is a monument of democracy, it should be the monument of a person who is ready to change his opinion on the basis of an argument. Now nobody is trying to change the opinion of anybody. On the basis of the big data, I know if you're going to vote, for whom you're going to vote. And the basic story is how to get my voters to the ballot box and how to keep your voters to stay home. And this is what has changed, in my view, in a big way. And unfortunately, it's not only Mercer, it's all political parties playing this game.
Alors, du coup, ça m'amène à une question que j'ai envie de vous poser à tous les quatre. À un moment donné, Carole Cadwalader, vous dites, je crois, Internet disrupte la démocratie. Je vais donc vous demander à tous, est-ce qu'Internet disrupte la démocratie ou est-ce que les réseaux sociaux, est-ce que l'usage du big data aggrave des problèmes déjà existants, au sens où la crise des démocraties occidentales, elle est quand même bien antérieure à la victoire de Trump?
Are you going to me? Sorry.
Oui, allez-y.
Oh, hello, hi, yes. It's so many fascinating topics to unpack there. I think where I feel that I can be sort of clearest is because these are such big questions that you're debating. And in a way, what I've had to do with this investigation is to narrow it down and actually just deal with known facts in a way. And so one of the things how I started off on this journey was looking at the referendum in Britain. And this was what led me on to the rest of the subject in a way, because we've got very strict spending laws in Britain about how much money a campaign can spend. And that is absolutely the bedrock of our entire electoral laws, and that's grown up over 100 years. And what we had seen, what these academics who were able to tell me was just how in 5 years, basically, a whole century of legislation that had grown up to protect our democratic, our entire democracy in Britain had been overturned, were useless, because the black box of Facebook meant that there was no way of accounting. We didn't know how much money, we still don't know how much money was spent online on adverts during the referendum. And there's no way of knowing. Only Facebook knows that, has that information. And so what became apparent is just how absolutely fundamentally useless the legislation that we have in Britain is to cope with the new age, the new digital platform age. And that was the thing which I found most alarming and disturbing, because I attended the sort of leading academics and regulators and everybody came together for a workshop at the beginning of last year, and that they all just sort of said, well, that's it, we no longer, our laws don't work, and that's it, we need new ones, we desperately need new ones. And they published this report, and then the government called a general election, and it was just nothing, absolutely nothing was done. And so I find this kind of helpful in a way, because what's happening in big data and the ways that it can be used to nudge people in certain ways, and what is happening, the whole issue of psychology there is a bigger question, and it is a more difficult question to disentangle. But just this very simple question of money, of now there is nothing in Britain that stops a billionaire buying an election, essentially. I mean, if you believe that spending more money buys more votes, and that's essentially what, certainly in America, people, encourages donors to spend lots of money, then we're living now in a society where there is nothing to stop that. And that's sort of fundamentally one of the more straightforward ways of looking at this, I feel.
Evgeny Morozov, est-ce qu'on est en train de perdre la main sur le débat démocratique?
Well, on our sort of cynical Eastern European couch, I think I play the token leftist while Ivan would play probably the token liberal. So for me, the problem is not really the internet that's disrupting democracy. It's very data-intensive, surveillance-driven capitalism that we are all embracing in one way or another. So if we really want to have digital infrastructure that's not driven by data collection or advertising or extraction of data for the purposes of building artificial intelligence, we need to have a different model to pay for it. Because right now, much of it is heavily subsidized, either by the need to show us ads or by the need to extract data to train deep learning systems so that you can actually have some AI products built with that data. That's what pays for your Google searches, your YouTube searches, your cat searches, and all the other online activities that you are pursuing for which you are not paying out of your own pocket. That, of course, has created this giant ecosystem, which has all sorts of negative consequences for democracy at large. I wouldn't deny that. They are susceptible to manipulation. But I think we have to be very clear in pointing the finger. And the finger, for me, is not necessarily pointing to big money, even though it clearly has an outsized influence on the political process, but it's also pointing it to the kind of structural features of this new ecosystem that we have, which will only get worse. I mean, they will not get by any way, less susceptible to manipulation. And I'm just fearing that in pointing fingers to the Mercers or to the Russians or to somebody else, we almost avoid asking the bigger question as to, can we have an alternative ecosystem? Can we have an alternative infrastructure? And by extension, an alternative economy that does not just run on extracting and sucking out our data and turning it into something else, because it's that very infrastructure that then encourages those firms to monetize our eyeballs, make us click on more and more links, and make sure that we click on links that are actually more traffic intensive than the other links. So that, to me, is the real problem. And yes, I fear for the future if that model continues. But I'm afraid those discussions are mostly missing from the public debate, and we are focusing on finding the scapegoat, which can be very satisfying, and not pointing to broader structural forces at play here, which of course then would open up all sorts of very troubling questions, including for the Democrats in America. For Obama, who was the best friend of Silicon Valley, he would guest edit Wired magazine just before leaving office. He would go and shake hands with the CEOs of all the tech companies. They were the good guys for the Democrats, right? There are all sorts of skeletons in the closet that I think need to come out for people to have a really honest, faithful conversation about what is really going on.
Yeah. I very much want to continue from here because there's three things. First of all, money in politics, is it a problem? It is a huge problem. But keep in mind, the Clinton campaign spent more money than Trump, and Stay campaign spent more money than Leave. So from this point of view, try to portray ourselves as victims. This is what I don't like. Because obviously we have a bigger problem. And one of the bigger problems is the following. I was told by somebody that Eric Schmidt, who, as you know, the head of Google, was the major CEO of the Clinton campaign. And he was very frustrated after the loss, but he was frustrated that she lost, but he was even more frustrated while Silicon Valley got it wrong. And he cheered up when he understood about Cambridge Analytica, because it was at least one of them did it. And this is my story. The other story that everything is going to be very much about technologies and micro-targeting and so on, what is remaining out of the voter? For me, this is the question that we're asking. Where we stand in all this? To what extent you're going to have a free individual who is making choices, and these choices can be right or wrong, but it's going to be my choices. And of course, many of the things that we're seeing are not new. Listen, being Bulgarian, to tell me that politics is run by rumors, this was how it was run. To say that you're not trusting the media, we have never been trusting the media for a very long time. So from this point of view, obviously we're touching on something much more important, certain type of an important collective identities that were helping us to do things is disappearing. And I do believe this is the question about how democracy is possible under these conditions, what you're going to do, for example, with technological infrastructure and so on. This is the question, because otherwise we can go very much to replicate what the right is doing, creating an ecosphere, because they're going to have 5 films like this. You're going to basically replace Mercer with Soros, and you're going to explain if Hillary Clinton was going to win. This is basically what I do believe is going to be the right type of discussions, and this is why at least I'm pushing on this. Obviously, we're facing a problem which goes bigger than one kind of a successful micro-targeting or one kind of a strange, speaking 1 hour per month billionaire putting money in something.
Mais c'est peut-être d'ailleurs la question principale que soulève le micro-ciblage. En même temps, c'est peut-être celle de son efficacité, mais aussi surtout ce que ça raconte de la manière dont on fait de la politique aujourd'hui et dont on envisage les électeurs, non plus comme un peuple, mais comme une collection d'intérêts particuliers. Paul-Olivier Dehaye, une réaction sur cette discussion ?
Je crois qu'on est en fait assez d'accord tous que le micro-ciblage, le micro-ciblage est un peu la source de beaucoup de problèmes, en tout cas la collection massive de données, l'utilisation massive de données sans contrôle de l'individu. Et on veut préserver quelque chose de commun, je pense, qui est le processus démocratique, ou en tout cas réimaginer ensemble ce que pourrait être le processus démocratique. Donc ça, c'est les points communs entre nous, peut-être pas exactement avec le film, ou la manière dont c'est présenté dans le film, qui se focalise effectivement sur un individu. Mais moi, je serais intéressé de souligner un point dans le film, qui est autour de David Carroll, donc cette personne qui a été demandé ces données à Cambridge Analytica, parce que ça c'était unique, c'était une opportunité unique. En fait, c'est moi qui l'ai contacté pour l'encourager à le faire, parce que cette société est basée en Angleterre, du coup il pouvait utiliser les lois anglaises, etc. Donc il avait certains avantages qui étaient assez uniques d'un point de vue américain. Donc quand il a demandé ces données, normalement, la société doit expliquer la source de la collecte de données, doit donner beaucoup plus d'informations. Et c'est un sujet sur lequel ils ont résisté énormément et continuent à résister. Donc il y a tout un cas juridique qui se lance. Et je voudrais insister là-dessus parce que c'est en fait le début, selon moi, que j'espère, le début d'une réaction individuelle, d'une réaction citoyenne à ces sujets-là. Une réappropriation des données qui va évidemment dans un sens que Evgeny a promu pendant très longtemps, une réappropriation des données autour du débat démocratique. Alors, ce n'est pas exactement une question, mais je voulais adresser une question à mes voisins, qui était de demander qu'est-ce qu'un individu peut faire pour contribuer à un changement dans ce contexte.
Est-ce que l'un de vous deux veut répondre?
I have to do it. So there's someone else here. Well, I mean, look, I think we can, of course, demand more transparency from those tech firms. And experience shows that in the past, they find a way to perfectly comply with certain requests for transparency without actually losing much power. So, I've analyzed that in one particular dimension, their cooperation with law enforcement and their cooperation with requests for censorship. Activists have been demanding it for a very long time. Please show us this data. In the end, now, some of them do show it. Google shows you how many times they get contacted by law enforcement, how many websites they have to take down. They get better in the metrics, and that has always been the kind of rallying cry of a lot of organizations in the human rights community, that, we need to have better rankings of those firms, we need to pressure them through basically shaming those who refuse to release this data. I think it's a path that we know how to tread, so to say, and I think there will be organizations that would tread it. But beyond that, I think ultimately, we need a massive macro level change to how the system operates. And this is where, we do need to start discussing to what extent the data on which these firms run should belong to them, so that then we have to go and ask them for that data, or whether by default it should belong to some other actor. That actor might be a nation state, municipality, collection of citizens. There are many models in which we can imagine it, in which case the data and analytics, to some extent, by default stays with us. Then they offer some services on top. Perhaps they pay for access to that data. So here your tax problem is solved right there, because they have to pay a licensing fee to access data that belongs to us, rather than the other way around, us paying with attention for the ads that they show us, and then some of those problems will get solved, right? But again, it requires a massive reorientation of the public debate away from kind of accepting the fact that online advertising is here to stay, and all we can do is just to tweak at the margins and ask them for some transparency reports. And pose the question of who should own data in general. Should it be treated as a commodity? Should it be treated as some kind of a national natural resource which cannot be owned by foreign companies and something of that sort? And that's a debate that I think Europe should start having, because to some extent countries like China have already answered it. They're not going to have that debate for another decade. They've already answered it. They'll come buy all the European firms that they need to continue with that aggressive expansion strategies. And Americans to some extent have sorted it out as well. They have a massive digital industry, and they're not going to do anything. They're just going to continue sucking out the data of other countries. So that's the debate we lack in Europe, and it's high time that we have it.
For me, this is going particularly to the technology problem, and as I told you, this is not my expertise, but we are facing a situation, and this is not only about us, the existence of big data, particularly being controlled. It could be a big companies. In the case of China, this is a state. This is changing very much the dynamic between democracy and authoritarianism. The biggest problem of the authoritarian state was the lack of relevant information about society. You're creating a huge police state system in order basically to get an information on the people. Listen, we're living in the world that nobody needs political informants anymore. We're informing on ourselves on a daily basis. You're reporting where you have been, what you have paid, what you have bought, all this information, and this is a true information. As a result of it, the potential to be manipulated and to be governed is totally different. And I do believe this is what, when we're talking simply about elections, this and that, I do believe we passed a certain type of a threshold in which the very meaning of how democracy works, what you can do and not do is critically important, but it is very different. And my last point on this is the following. There was a famous American economist and sociologist, Albert Hirschman, who was always making a major distinctions between how people behaved on the market and how he believed they behaved in politics. And he said, listen, when you're in the market and when you don't like certain things, what you're doing, you're exiting. If you basically don't like certain type of a product, you're not going to start writing letters to the producers in order to change the quality. You're going to buy a new one. But he said on the field of politics, there are certain things that are so important for us that it's not easy to exit. It's our political loyalties, our country, our religion. And this is why when something is going wrong, basically, people are trying to voice, to try to change it. The basic problem which I see is that we all started to behave on the field of the politics in the way we behaved on the field of the market. When you don't like something, you're exiting. You see everybody's ready to make a new party. Nobody's ready to invest, basically to reform a certain type of existing party. If you see, do you know what is the percent of the Americans which are changing their confession in their lifetime? Religious identity. 40%. So from this point of view, the problem of politics is very much also about certain level of loyalties and how it works and how basically you can use them. And I do believe this is why technological party is one of them, but the other is basically, can we behave on the political field differently than we're behaving on the market field? Is a citizen different than the consumer?
Carole Cadwallader, vous êtes journaliste, votre métier c'est d'enquêter, c'est d'aller chercher derrière le rideau, comme on dit. Mais qu'est-ce qui, selon vous, serait justement nécessaire pour rebâtir d'une certaine manière le débat démocratique? Vous disiez tout à l'heure que finalement la législation britannique sur le financement des campagnes était devenue totalement inopérante face à ce que permettent les technologies publicitaires aujourd'hui. Donc par où vous commenceriez?
I think I would start with, it's so fascinating, and you've got such amazing speakers here, and there's these brilliant ideas going back and forth. And the thing that's, it's a very specialist argument at the moment. This is a very specialist debate, it seems. And one of the things which I think is most important is just translating this debate to people, to ordinary people who've got really busy lives and have got lots of other things going on. And I think one of the key things which somebody said to me last year was, it was this journalist who'd been kind of covering technology from way back in the 80s. And she just said, oh, data's this, her editor said to her, data, it's this terrible, terrible word. And it's so off-putting. And he said to her, you've got to remember that data is basically, it's like a naked photograph of yourself. And that's the way to start thinking about this and telling people that actually the problem isn't data, it's these little revealing snippets of you which are all around the place, which is put together is some sort of naked portrait of yourself. And I think this feeling of discomfort really is something that is one of the things, to make people understand that this is personal. It's about them, it's about their privacy. And so that's one of the things which I'm sort of want to communicate, I suppose. And you talked about David Carroll, who's in the film, and Ravi Naik, who's his lawyer, is the solicitor in London who's taking that case. He makes a very compelling argument, which is that, because he's not a data lawyer, he's a human rights lawyer. And the reason he's taken David Carroll's case and is going through this extraordinary process is because he's like data rights, a human rights. And that's a sort of thing that I want to inject into this. There's just this very basic thing that it's about ordinary people, and it's about our ordinary lives and just the bits of ourselves which we don't want harvested by billionaires to use in whichever way. And so that, for me, it's a communication issue is at the heart of this in many ways.
Paul-Olivier Dehaye, la manière dont évolue la régulation en la matière, c'est un point d'appui. Je pense notamment au règlement européen sur les données personnelles, par exemple, qui est quand même globalement assez bien accueilli par les défenseurs des libertés sur Internet, parce qu'ils disent que ça va quand même donner des points d'appui, et d'ailleurs pas seulement des points d'appui aux utilisateurs, mais ça va aussi permettre de sanctionner les entreprises qui traitent les données sans respecter les droits des utilisateurs.
Oui, alors pour donner un peu de contexte, donc il y a un nouveau règlement européen qui vient en mai 2018, qui donne un peu plus de droits aux individus, mais qui vient aussi avec une promesse d'être appliqué plus sérieusement que les règles précédentes. Donc c'est pas forcément un gros changement en loi, mais c'est surtout un gros changement en application de la loi. Et je pense que des histoires comme celle-ci autour de la politique, qui est en gros un processus commun dans lequel on est tous investis, il ne s'agit pas juste des photos nues de quelqu'un bien précis dont je ne me soucie peu, mais du débat démocratique dans lequel j'ai beaucoup plus d'intérêt. Donc il y a une prise de conscience autour de ces sujets-là, que les données sont importantes, et donc on peut s'attendre à ce que les régulateurs appliquent les règles de manière plus stricte. Je pense quand même que ce règlement donc ma start-up travaille dans ce domaine-là, donc on réfléchit vraiment précisément aux implications de ce règlement. Il y a des effets très pervers qui sont possibles aussi. Donc c'est très important qu'il y ait une prise de conscience collective qui est vraiment que les gens s'accaparent, en fait. Peut-être pas tout le monde, mais que beaucoup de gens s'accaparent de ces sujets et de leurs droits et cherchent à les exercer. Donc ça, pour moi, c'est assez crucial, parce que sinon, on va en quelque sorte rater une opportunité de réorganiser tous ces débats-là autour de l'individu. Voilà.
Evgeny Morozov, vous disiez tout à l'heure, il n'y a pas... Oui, bien sûr. Il me semblait qu'on était à peu près un peu moins d'une heure de discussion. Mais vous voulez poser une question tout de suite ou...
Les gens s'accaparent le débat.
Oui, merci. Je voudrais savoir comment est-ce qu'on peut faire si on veut faire la même démarche qu'a fait cet Américain pour récupérer nos données personnelles auprès de Facebook, par exemple, ou de Twitter, ou de n'importe qui.
Cet Américain est...
Donc elle parle de David Carroll, qui était dans le... Donc justement, utiliser ces droits, donc ça veut dire soit vous avez deux options, soit vous lisez la loi, vous engagez dans une longue démarche qui va vous exténuer ou vous fatiguer, vous le ferez pas, ou alors de la pub gratuite, vous allez sur personaldata.io et vous utilisez les services qui sont là, qui sont gratuits, qui sont précisément autour de cette prise de contrôle, prise de conscience autour des données personnelles.
Il y a notamment un Autrichien aussi qui a fait précisément ça avec ses données Facebook, qui s'appelle Max Schrems et qui a reçu plusieurs milliers de pages dans mes souvenirs. On va rapidement terminer, parce que du coup j'ai l'impression que la salle s'impatiente. Vous disiez, Evgeny Morozov, il y a peu de débats publics encore. Moi j'ai l'impression qu'il émerge beaucoup, ce débat sur les données. Il y a même un débat en France sur est-ce qu'on doit être chacun propriétaire de ces données pour pouvoir les vendre, ou est-ce qu'au contraire il faut repenser ça complètement. Vous avez l'impression quand même que ça va dans le bon sens, ou qu'on a toujours un train de retard par rapport à la technologie?
Well, look, let me just again go back to this data question, because in Europe, the data question is mostly framed as a question of privacy on the one hand, and to some extent entrepreneurialism. That once we become owners of our own data, we would be able to derive a check every month from how data is being used for advertising. To a large extent, these two dimensions, the legal one and the entrepreneurial one, are the dominant domains and the sort of dimensions of the debate about data. The dimension which is lacking is the way in which data is connected to, on the one hand, the non-existence of industrial strategy in Europe, which relates to the development of artificial intelligence, which is all built with data, and B, the transformation of the democratic process, whereby through data you can experiment with more decentralized public, local forms of government, which will help to address some of the populist anger against centralized hierarchical bureaucratic institutions. So those two dimensions, one, industrial strategy based around AI, and B, decentralization of public administration by means of data and empowering citizens, are completely lacking in Europe. They do not really appear in most public debates, which are pushed for by people trained in law, who frame everything as a matter of privacy, and people who have a very liberal outlook on data as a commodity, so they would like to make all of us as individuals owners and proprietors of data, which is a solution which I don't believe in, because I don't think that data is a commodity and should be treated as such, because a lot of the data we produce is actually social in character. We produce it as part of the collective. We produce it as walking down on a street in a public space. There is no reason for me to claim that data is my own, because who knows who paid for the sensors which are collecting it and who paid for the road on which I'm walking. So if we really want to have a robust discussion with robust political teeth, we really have to reopen those two other dimensions, because otherwise it will remain in that consumer sphere which Ivan was alluding to. Because the problem that we have is that once you frame everything as a problem of privacy, then the only viable solution that currently exists on the market is to actually pay for privacy as a service, get yourself a number of apps, pay for them 100 euros or francs a month, and be protected from manipulation, fake news, be protected from cyber attacks, be protected from Russian hackers stealing your data, be protected from all sorts of manipulation on Google search engine. You can already pay for that. If you have enough money, you can have all your privacy you want. What we have lost is the language and the discourse to address questions like privacy, like self-determination, like what they have in Germany, informational self-determination, through the language of rights, and not just through the language of services. Because virtually that's the model on which everything is supplied to us these days. And I think that we're not really having that debate, and the fact that we're just talking about data, to me, does not mean anything, because most of the discussions we are having, from where I stand politically and economically and geopolitically in Europe, are completely futile. Even though, yes, there are a lot of them, and there are even a lot of them in Brussels. It does not make them into productive, useful conversations around which some kind of future which will appeal to people who might otherwise vote for populists, or who might otherwise vote for Trump, would actually be appealing. Those discussions, as far as I'm concerned, and I go to a lot of them, are not really taking place.
Paul-Olivier Dehaye, vous vouliez rebondir.
Alors, donc ça touche à ce que je disais juste avant, sur le fait que le nouveau règlement offre des ouvertures pour changer justement le débat. Donc un exemple, c'est le droit à la portabilité qui vient en mai, qui permettrait à tout un chacun dans la salle qui le voudrait d'aller se réapproprier ses données auprès d'une centaine d'entreprises, de grandes entreprises, et puis de le confier à l'EPFL, donc l'université locale, par exemple, ou l'université de Genève, ou aux collectivités. Donc ça c'est un discours que je sais qu'Evgeny promeut beaucoup, la collectivité autour de la propriété des données, ou l'utilisation des données. Et c'est important, selon moi, tout comme pour vous, de passer à cette autre dimension, au-delà du consommateur, au-delà de la protection de la vie privée, mais vraiment la protection des données pour le bien commun. Donc
One tiny response to it. So imagine, Amazon spends $15 billion a year on research and development. Chinese company Alibaba has committed $10 billion over the next 3 years to artificial intelligence. Now, my data becomes portable. Great. Where do I take it? If all of the firms and all of the services which have this advanced technology and which they have spent billions are outpacing every single public agency, university and local council in building actual infrastructures where such data can be inserted and be made useful. I take all my data from Google, great. Where do I take it in a way that will interconnect my car, my house, my bat, and everything else that is now part of the Google ecosystem? I'm not saying that data portability is a bad thing. I'm saying that it cannot be the solution behind which all of us will rally behind and celebrate it as the answer to all of our problems, because our market is not the neoliberal utopia where everything is competitive. We have 5 big players with massive state funding behind them, and those are unfortunately the players to which you have to turn, even if your data is fully portable. For the most part, there are a lot of startups. They do not really compare to Amazon or to Alibaba.
On pourrait en discuter encore pendant des heures, mais il y a quand même un moment où il va falloir conclure. Je vais vous demander d'ailleurs, Carole Cadwallader et Ivan Krastev, un mot de conclusion avant de passer la parole à Sylvain Guisler, que je n'oublie pas. Carole Cadwallader, peut-être vous voulez commencer. Qu'est-ce que tout ça vous inspire? Sur quoi vous voudriez conclure ce débat?
Well, actually, I'd just really love to hear what people in the audience have to say, to be honest with you. I think that's what's sort of fascinating about any of these discussions I've been to is people. We just need more voices in this debate. That's one of the key things, I think. When I started out on this, it was very much technology was written about by technology journalists, and it was technologists who spoke about technology, and people in Silicon Valley who spoke about technology. And one of the really, really key things I've learned is we just need more people from completely different backgrounds looking at this subject in different ways. So I have these fascinating discussions with people from all over the kind of academic spectrum. And I love the perspective they bring, which is completely different. So having a philosopher, interested in these issues, having an anthropologist, having somebody who's an ethnographer. And one of the best events I've been to actually is where there has been this input from just lots of different voices, because technology is just too important. Give up that word now. It's everything. It's just the world. And we've all got to be sort of thinking about this and talking about it and bringing in people from all sorts of different areas. Sorry, I'm going on now, but you get my point.
Je pense que tout le monde sera d'accord probablement. Ivan Krastev.
Yeah. Listen, for me the critical question is the following. Democracy is based on the idea of political equality. And during the 50s and 60s, the major political scientists were asking the question, can we be politically equal if we're economically so unequal? So this was the question. With the big data society, it's becoming even much more important, because democracy and egalitarianism is the following. What we're equal is not our intelligence, but our experience. In democracy, my experience is as valuable as yours. Nobody knows better than me what I want. This is what democracy is based on. This is what my vote is about. The problem with all this type of a big data is we understand that now that my wife knows better. I mean, the technology knows better than my wife, which is not surprising. But the basic problem is that at some point, the big data knows better than me. And this is the story. And one of the major stories when we talk about the trust, and particularly the crisis of the trust in mainstream media, this was the collapse of the local papers. Because it was the local newspapers and the fact that you have an experience which is real, and through them in a certain way you're also building your trust in other type of a media you can compare and so on. Local media disappeared. There was a lot of studies showing in the United States very strong correlations of people living in places where there is not local newspapers surviving, being much more ready to be kind of a consumers of a fake news. And in my view, how to make our real life experience matter in taking political decisions. This is critically important. Otherwise, there is technology, there is a legal story, there is others. But we're empowering ourselves by making our kind of a real life experiencing matter. And from this point, doing things. This is why when people go on the street, when they go to protest, when they go to do something with their bodies and not simply clicking, this is changing politics much more. And this is why basically some of these technologies does not work in the way they normally work on the elections.
Merci à tous les quatre. Avant de passer la parole à la salle, on va accueillir Sylvain Gisler, qui est donc le cofondateur d'Opération Libéraux, qui est un mouvement politique, hein, il le revendique comme ça, donc un mouvement politique suisse qui lutte contre l'extrême droite en essayant d'avoir un usage positif et enthousiasmant de la technologie, et qui va donc conclure cette discussion. À qui revient la lourde tâche de conclure cette discussion.
Hi, glad to see you all. Thanks to be here. I'm Sylvain Gisler. I'm a campaigner, like not from Trump, not from Brexit. I'm from Operation Libero, like the liberal movement in Switzerland. And I guess it's late, it's dark outside, but I'm here to kind of bring the optimist perspective into online campaigning for the future. That's what I normally do in discussions like this. Like
Optimism
this.
in front.
Optimism to the light. No. Well, I'm from Operation Libero. We started 4 years ago. We're a liberal political movement from Switzerland. We started with zero money, zero impact, zero whatever. And now we're here. We fought in votations against mostly right-wing populists, and we won 5 times. We fought 5 times. We won 5 times, and we're now completely crowdfunded. We have a great community. We have even a group here in Geneva who's supporting us, who does a great job in campaigning as well. And, well, all this wouldn't have happened without the internet, without the technology which gave us tools to make campaigning on a level without money, or without money at the beginning. So I think this is the positive perspective I want to bring in. I think political campaign and online campaigning and the internet gives lots of opportunities to do this. And, well, I talked before this panel, if this is an exceptional case and the other cases like we talked today about are the way we go there through. I don't think so. I mean, we talked also about the Barack Obama campaign and why there wasn't this critical point of view we had now in this discussion. And I guess there's one reason. It's pretty simple, and let's be honest, we don't like the result of these campaigns, right? We don't like that they won. And this time, the bad guys won. And it leads to us that technology, which we thought can be something in campaigning where a civic movement can engage and disrupt maybe systems, is something that is being used for good and bad, and it's clear that it's being used from everyone, as it has been told in this panel as well. So this is one reason, and the second reason, I guess, it's something about losing control. It's losing control from a public point of view because we don't know exactly what's happening. This is what we talked, or Carol talked about, democracy in darkness. And the other point of losing control is like we don't own our data anymore. So this is what we talk also about, that we aren't owners of our data anymore. So there's 2 types of losing control, and I think this all leads to a certain criticism of new technologies, and I think this is right. It also leads to a mistrust of what's going to happen. And 1.5 weeks ago, we had a votation in Switzerland where the initiative wanted to shut down the public media. And there have been polls. 1 week before the votation, the polls said, well, the initiative is going to end with 60% no voters. So it was pretty clear that the initiative won't succeed. But there have been a lot of people who said, I don't believe it. I think something's going on in the underground. There's maybe some dark posts. We don't know what happens. And I think this is something which is important, and I want to bring in here, like this mistrust that in the political system, and this mistrust in campaigning, and the thinking that there's something like black magic somewhere. And I think I told them then, well, I'm a campaigner, and they're completely overrating my job. It's completely overrated. I guess it's not about magic, and I think this is important also for the discussion. Like of course, it's about technology, it's about tools, it's about how effective are they. We don't know yet exactly how effective they were. We know that there have been an impact, and Trump at Brexit and whatever. But it's not dark magic, it's not Sauron, it's not Gandalf the White, it's not Harry Potter, and it's not Lord Voldemort. It's just, there are tools and it's technicians, and we have to deal with it, and I guess we can deal with it in good or in bad manners. And so it's just an appeal to take back control, to just like make a citation of Brexit campaign. We can take back control in kind of that we can have to deal with this situation. We can also, like civic movements, can use these tools, and we can, like, when there are fake news, for example, then let's fight them. We can, for Operation Libero, we have online warriors who go out there and fight against fake news. So we had built a tool against the other tool. So I think this is kind of a way to go in taking back control as much as we can. That's it.
Merci beaucoup. La parole est à vous. Pour alors soit effectivement un des trois panélistes, ou Sylvain Gisler, ou Thomas Huchon qui est dans la salle, qui sont également prêts à répondre à vos questions. Et Carole Cadwallader qui est toujours en ligne avec nous, malgré l'heure tardive.
J'ai une question pour le réalisateur. Il n'a pas abordé la question de l'implication éventuelle des Russes dans l'élection de Trump. Est-ce que c'était volontaire? Est-ce qu'il peut commenter sa décision? Merci.
Ouais, alors effectivement, le film est sorti en juin 2017 sur la plateforme Spicy. Donc nous, on a arrêté de tourner au mois de fin mars 2017. D'ailleurs, c'était à Genève ici avec Paul Olivier. Et en fait, à ce moment-là, j'ai pas les moyens factuels d'impliquer ou de démontrer qu'il y a des Russes dans cette histoire. Depuis, bien entendu, qu'on en a trouvé. Je pense que Carole, qui est là, en a trouvé aussi un certain nombre. Et effectivement, mais alors pour voir grosso modo ce qui s'est passé dans l'année écoulée, je vous renvoie à un film qui a été diffusé sur Arte hier soir, qui est un film de Paul Moreira sur justement les manipulations russes de la campagne américaine. Après, je crois que dans ce film, bien entendu qu'on a conscience du rôle qu'ont essayé de jouer certains Russes, certains agents russes, certaines personnes. Mais je crois que le rôle joué par M. Mercer et par Cambridge Analytica dépasse de manière énorme ce qui a été fait par les Russes. Les éléments dont on dispose aujourd'hui, c'est qu'il y a eu 470 pages Facebook qui ont été créées par des Russes et qu'avec $100 000 de financement publicitaire ciblé sur Facebook, ils ont touché plus de 150 millions de citoyens américains. Donc maintenant, on va se dire que ce n'est pas $100 millions qu'a mis M. Mercer, même s'il n'est peut-être pas aussi puissant qu'on le voudrait, en écoutant Evgeny et les autres panélistes, c'est $11 millions. Donc si on multiplie ce chiffre de 150 millions d'Américains touchés par la proportion équivalente, on arrive à des chiffres absolument colossaux. Je crois que juste pour rebondir sur ce que disait Sylvain, bien entendu que les résultats de ces élections nous déplaisent, mais ils ne nous déplaisent pas parce qu'on est de gauche ou parce qu'on est de droite, ils nous déplaisent parce qu'ils font venir au pouvoir des personnes autoritaires qui ne respectent pas la démocratie. Et finalement, je crois que le vrai point fondamental qu'il y a là-dessus, c'est aussi la personnalité de ces candidats. Mais moi, personnellement, je suis contre les outils. Je suis pas, et j'aurais été contre ces outils. J'ai d'ailleurs critiqué la campagne de Bernie Sanders qui utilisait ces outils. Pourtant, c'est le candidat dont j'aurais pu, moi, être le plus proche aux États-Unis. Et étant un citoyen américain, j'aurais peut-être voté pour Bernie Sanders. Mais je crois que le problème n'est pas tant dans l'usage, le problème est dans l'outil. Et c'est par rapport à ça qu'il y a un enjeu aujourd'hui.
D'autres questions? Oui, je vois. Oh là, il y a plein de mains qui se lèvent d'un coup.
Hein? Il marche? Oui, il marche. Bonsoir. J'aurais d'abord un commentaire à faire au politicien suisse qui nous a parlé. Je trouve que c'est assez salutaire de la part du peuple américain d'avoir voté pour Trump, qui est peut-être un bad guy, mais qui est 10 fois mieux que cette épouvantable personne de Hillary Clinton, qui a donné son support à Nicolas Sarkozy, qui était à la tête de la coalition, qui a attaqué illégalement la Libye, et la Libye qui avait à sa tête un dictateur, mais était quand même la Suisse du Maghreb, et un pays moins corrompu que beaucoup d'autres pays du Maghreb. Ça, c'est tout ce que je voulais dire. Et maintenant, pour ma question, je lis le titre là. La démocratie est-elle soluble dans Internet? Et ça me rend très, très fâché de lire ce titre. Je vais vous dire pourquoi. On accuse Internet d'être responsable de la plupart des fake news. Est-ce qu'on oublie que en prenant le cas de la France, est-ce qu'on oublie que depuis 70 ans, à cause de la censure des différents gouvernements français, les médias français ont été abreuvés soit de fake news, le public français, soit de fake news, soit de nouvelles.
Est-ce que vous avez une question, monsieur,
oui,
pour les intervenants?
Eh bien, est-ce que vous ne croyez pas que depuis que l'existence d'Internet, c'est la première fois depuis l'existence de l'humanité que les gens ils peuvent chercher des news en passant par-dessus la tête des gouvernements qui ne font que censurer les informations. Voilà.
Par ailleurs, personne n'a dit qu'Internet était responsable des fake news qui sont en général fabriquées par des êtres humains. Il n'y a pas de d'essentialisation du réseau. Je ne sais pas si quelqu'un a envie de rebondir.
Juste peut-être pour préciser un élément, vous avez totalement le droit d'avoir vos opinions, monsieur, et c'est très bien de venir les exprimer. Juste pour dire quelque chose, le peuple américain n'a pas choisi Donald Trump. Les Américains ont voté pour Hillary Clinton, même si c'était certainement une très mauvaise candidate. Mais elle a 3 millions de voix d'avance aux États-Unis sur la totalité du territoire. Donc il faut comprendre quand même le fait que et c'était déjà arrivé que des candidats qui aient moins de voix au niveau national gagnent. Mais George Bush, en 2000, quand il gagne, enfin, on attend toujours les décomptes, mais quand il remporte l'élection présidentielle, il a 250, 300 000 voix d'avance, de retard sur son adversaire. C'est-à-dire que là, on est dans une proportion qui est 10 fois supérieure. 3 millions de voix d'écart sur 120 millions d'électeurs, de suffrages exprimés. Donc le peuple américain n'a pas voté pour Donald Trump. C'est pas vrai. C'est une fake news.
Si je peux répondre quand même à la substance de la question. Donc je crois qu'Internet offre vraiment, pour aller dans votre sens, la possibilité à tout un chacun d'accéder à plus d'informations que jamais dans le passé. Je sors mon téléphone, vous pouvez me poser une question, en 1 minute j'ai la réponse, à peu près. Le problème, c'est que beaucoup de gens n'ont pas une compréhension suffisamment grande des mécanismes qui vont leur amener cette information. Et du coup, cette information peut être en fait empoisonnée, intentionnellement ou pas, pour les influencer. les gens n'ont pas encore, les gens, la masse des gens, et moi-même aussi, hein, ça m'arrive aussi régulièrement, on n'a pas la capacité, il y a un problème de provenance, il y a un problème de traçabilité de l'information qui fait que vraiment cette liberté d'accès à l'information peut aussi être dommageable pour nos réflexions personnelles.
Can I add something also? Very quickly, because I think, we can disagree with the opinions expressed, but, I think they do point to a dimension that we cannot be hiding from. And it's that before this Trump election and Brexit triggered this wave of concerns about fake news, there have been a lot of very legitimate reasons to challenge and doubt the ability of most experts in many fields to do their job correctly. We have seen this throughout the last decade, or last 2 decades. Journalists, and especially American journalists, who dragged the entire country and many others into a war over a non-existing premise in the Middle East. We have seen economists failing badly to address, even predict the economic crisis, with the Queen of England, the greatest populist known to humanity, accusing them of actually failing to do their job properly. We have a lot of people being very angry at politicians for being corrupt and having all sorts of corrupt deals with the companies, lobbyists, and many other institutional groups. We cannot be hiding from that by pretending that it's just Putin or Russia Today or Facebook or the Mercers who are driving all this discontent with those experts. This discontent is real, and it has a base in actual reality. And I think that we have to understand that this is something that is happening, and we cannot just be pretending that any legitimate questioning of journalistic, political, economic, or any other kind of expertise is just an expression of mad populism and people influenced and brainwashed by ads they see online. Because this is not the case. That anger is real, and that anger has to do with the actual reality that people experience as they go about living their lives. And I think that it's the elites, many of them in the media, who keep living in that bubble, thinking that our democracy functions perfectly, media do their job, and everything from the economists to think tanks to everything else has up until now been uncorrupted by money and by private donations and by money coming from oil companies or Wall Street or Silicon Valley. And now, in the last 2 or 3 years, because of our data leaving our files, somehow we've all become susceptible. It's a very simplistic narrative that will trigger an even bigger populist backlash. So I think we should not be hiding away from it, and we should actually be able to prepare to stand up and say that, yes, fake news, crisis, manipulation of opinion, and so forth, but there are very real reasons why people flock to sites like Breitbart. And it has to do with the fact that there is an overall crisis of legitimacy in mainstream media, and that crisis is real. It's not fake, it's not manufactured from the outside. It's not manufacturing. Of course, there are forces that take advantage of it, but you cannot be denying that that anger has been brewing for many people for decades. It's not the manufacturing of fake news or Facebook.
No, but I totally agree with what you said, but we cannot say that there is not... I totally agree with what you say, Yevgeny. I totally agree. There is a real problem with legitimacy. But this does not put away the fact that there are real manipulators of our mind that put billions of dollars into this and work creating fake news, creating fake content, creating conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic thing, racist stuff. And these people are funded, they are a lot of money, and they are doing this job. So I totally agree with you. But on the other side, there's also the bad guys doing the bad job.
Sure. But, calling them bad guys is so simplistic because most of those bad guys are the people we elect. You've seen in your own film that most of Cambridge Analytica contracts come from NATO, British government, and many other government organizations. Those are not bad guys, those are people we elect.
But just one sentence.
French are the good guys now.
Yeah,
okay.
But let's agree on, and I do believe we have agreement. There is a real problem. And of course, when there is a real problem, there are people who are trying to profit out of it. The problem is on what you're going to focus. One is basically to say what happened was simply the conspiracy, vast conspiracy, as one presidential candidate used to say, and if there was no Mercer, our democracy is going to function normally. This is where basically our disagreement comes. Of course there is Mercer and there is Bannon, and there always have been people who have been doing and trying to manipulate people on this and that. But the idea of the manipulation is you stop to be interested in why these people behave in the way they are. You're putting them as the victims of somebody who is playing basically their minds and why they're doing this. There was something wrong not to be interested why people are voting for somebody as mean as Trump. To be honest, what struck me, and it's not about politics, people does not need to be great on judging on the political ideas of leaders, but I do believe what was striking in the case of Donald Trump is that they voted for somebody who as a character is very mean. And it was obvious to everybody. So from this point of view, it's about human qualities, it's not about political positions. But this became obvious because for them, his meanness was the only way to punish the elite. You entered up with a democracy in which the most important is to punish the other side to suffer, to be hurt. And this is you're going to vote for the ugliest, for the most awful, and this is what you like in him.
Oula, alors là, du coup, il y a plein de mains qui se lèvent.
C'est moi qui ai le micro, je crois. Du coup, c'est moi qui avais posé la prochaine question. Je m'excuse pour les autres. Alors, d'abord, je voudrais remercier tous les intervenants pour ce débat très intéressant. Je vais essayer de faire très bref. Derrière tout ce que vous avez dit sur le big data, il y a, il me semble, beaucoup de questions morales que vous avez soulevées. Et derrière tout ça, il y a un domaine qui chevauche en fait ces questions, c'est la communication politique dans son ensemble. Et dans ce vaste domaine, vous l'avez dit vous-même, c'est un domaine qui est en évolution, qui s'est beaucoup développé. Le micro-targeting, c'est pas la première chose, mais il y a aussi d'autres choses négatives qui ont été attribuées à la campagne de 2016 comme étant inouïes, comme le niveau de négativisme, au final, qu'on a vu durant cette campagne. Donc ma question est la suivante. Derrière ces questions d'intuition morale, de big data, de campagne négative, même si ça n'a pas été soulevé, ça a été soulevé dans les débats médiatiques. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas aussi la question de comment est-ce qu'on approche la communication politique dans la société états-unienne, mais de plus en plus aussi dans les sociétés européennes et démocratiques dans leur ensemble?
Qui veut répondre? Qui s'y colle?
Listen, there is one interesting story, and I very much agree that what is changing is very understanding of how we know the world, not simply what is happening in politics. When you talk about big data, being a social scientist, this is what strikes me. Listen, big data now is going to change the social sciences in the way it is changing politics. But what is interesting about the big data is you don't need to answer the question why anymore. You go with the big data, and you basically go with likeliness. I'm going to tell you that if you have BMW and if you have a croissant every day, probably you're going to vote, I don't know for whom. But the only problem is that I'm not interested anymore why you're doing this. Before you have a theory, you go for a sample and you have an explanation that you're trying to understand, is it right or wrong? And as a result of it, our understanding of society was trying to understand why people were doing what they're doing and so on. Most of our theories were wrong or partial, it doesn't matter. But imagine that in the big data society, you're going to have a much more precise predictions how people are going to behave in this or that situation, but you're not going to be interested anymore why they're doing this. And I'm saying this because as a result of it, all of these people, political communication, sociologists and others, they're going to become probably more precise in their predictions, but they're also going to lose power because they cannot create a narrative anymore. You cannot tell anymore why people are doing what they're doing. And this is why it's not simply about political communication in terms of consultancy. It is how to try to describe a society in which people basically populated totally different worlds. Before Mercer spent this money, 43% of the Americans in year 2007 believed that there was a weapons of mass destruction being found in Iraq. So you have a kind of a parallel realities being constructed, and this was not even about micro-targeting, it was about identity. You are not pushed to change your views. You basically, any statement that you make is not about reality, but who I am. Where do I stand? Am I Republican or Democrat? Do I like... Listen, when you said that there's 3 million people voted for Hillary Clinton, and it's absolutely true. But to be honest, knowing how you're winning elections, probably if the other candidate knew that he should win the national vote, he was going to have a different strategy. So, and if you see how many governors and Congress and senators there on the Republican side, this argument also is not going to be enough. So from my point of view, it's not about identity. It's about trying to understand society, which in my view is much more difficult to understand before. And here technology helps to understand, but also blurs, confuses us, makes us believing that we know more when we know less.
I think you provided your own answer to a question that you asked earlier in the debate, which was how to reconcile micro-targeting with the fact that Trump seemed so chaotic and said everything and the opposite. So actually, the Cambridge Analytica, the Trump campaign, was doing things differently from Cruz or from the Clinton campaign, in that they were not building a theory, so this is documented, they were not building a theory of which message would resonate with which audience. They were just, as you just said, trying a lot of different messages with a lot of different samples of audiences. So a big matrix of everything that was possible, seeing which messages were effective before amplifying the message nationwide or statewide, the message they wanted to push. And this was very different from what they were doing in the Cruz campaign, where they were basically swamped with building theories for each small audience of what was the best message to push. So what I find really interesting is that your own impulse now in the debate was to find a narrative around the past election, around what happened, the fact that Trump was mean, and that's what appealed to voters. So you're essentially trying to summarize something that the machines, in a way, uncovered live during the election. Both have value, but it's a different value than before.
Totally agree, but here comes my question. If it is only about technology, and if Cambridge Analytica can win with micro-targeting any campaign, because in a certain way the candidate doesn't matter, why on the primaries Ted Cruz didn't make it? And it was Donald Trump, which then there was no Cambridge Analytica, there was not Mercer behind him, he was just basically on his own. So from this point of view, I do believe that, of course, micro-targeting matters. And to be honest, I do believe that the way the political consultants see democracy is an important way of how it functions, but it should not be the only way we try to understand what is happening.
But also in our phenomenological experience of everyday life, I mean, I'm sorry to say, maybe I'm the outlier and everybody in this audience is different, but I see hundreds of ads a day. I get convinced by none of them. So yes, I get exposed to hundreds of different shoes. I don't buy any of them on a daily basis. The idea that people behave like zombies who seeing an ad about guns on Facebook suddenly change their opinion and realize that, hey, Trump would be much better for me if I really like guns. And they suddenly get swayed and vote for Trump while they cannot even get convinced to buy a new pair of shoes. I just find it treating people like a bunch of idiot algorithmic zombies. It's like it's a model of politics that reduces people to automatons. That is much worse than whatever these people at Cambridge Analytica are doing. Like, I don't see it in daily life happening. Sorry, like, I don't know, maybe all of you get swayed by these ads, but the kind of narrative of politics we are building, that people are just a bunch of idiots who see an ad and realize that Clinton stands on one side, Trump stands on another, and they never knew before where they actually stand. That, you know, they thought maybe Trump would be the best cosmopolitan, protecting the rights of refugees and banning guns and, you know, defending, I don't know, the immigrants. Like, whoever thought that in America? If you watch Fox News and CNN, which is what Americans do, by and large, they all know where those candidates stand on most issues. I mean, yes, it's all important, but let's not actually get away from reality, which is that most Americans get their political views formed on Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN.
I agree, but on the micro-targeting, I missed one element that was also different from the previous campaigns, is what they were optimizing for. So, of course, you cannot tell, I'm optimizing for the number of votes I'll collect. But they were optimizing like any marketer would do. That's what they were doing on the Trump side, not the Clinton side, for retweets, reshares, likes, comments, very basic things on a platform, exactly the signals that the platform picks on to decide what content people engage with, what other people, like the initial ones, are likely to engage as well. So there's this amplification effect that's based precisely on the signals that the Trump campaign was trying to optimize. So we were saying earlier, Facebook was only used the way it was supposed to be used. That's exactly true. And that wasn't the case by the Clinton campaign. They were definitely not doing that. There was definitely difference in the way they were using the Facebook platform between the two campaigns.
Je voudrais quand même parce que ça va toucher à sa fin, il est déjà 23h30 tout juste passé. Je voudrais juste qu'on prenne une dernière question, courte, de préférence, avec une réponse que j'espère assez courte aussi.
Alors le micro est ici. J'ai pensé en écoutant le débat et en voyant le film à quelque chose qui peut paraître complètement décalé, mais c'est le télégraphe. Le télégraphe, il y a une métaphore qui dit le fil qui chante. Je me suis demandé si Internet, c'était le réseau qui enchante, mais alors quel est l'enchantement ? Parce que cet enchantement à travers le modèle démocratique, évidemment, qu'il nous séduit, et j'espère qu'il va nous séduire encore longuement. Par contre, dans le film, il y a un petit détail qui m'a frappé, dont nous n'avons pas parlé, c'est dans le mythe du millionnaire, auquel nous rêvons peut-être chacun, celui qui se trouve ici dit « je ne parle qu'une heure par mois ». Je ne sais pas si vous l'avez aussi noté. Est-ce que c'est ça le mythe du millionnaire qui reste, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a plus de parole, donc il n'y a plus de démocratie? Voilà.
Est-ce que ça appelle une réponse ou est-ce que ça sera le
Je
mot de
ne
la
suis pas
fin
certain que ça appelle une réponse, mais je vous remercie de votre remarque. Je crois qu'effectivement, ce personnage incarne par beaucoup d'aspects ce qui nous fait peur. Parce qu'en plus, il ne s'exprime même pas. Il est très puissant, personne n'en a entendu parler, et pourtant, il ne s'exprime jamais. Et pourtant, il a une influence, il a une action. Mais effectivement, je trouve que cette analogie que vous avez détectée, qui était involontaire de ma part, est parfaite, et je me permettrai de la réutiliser dans de prochaines conférences.
Je crois qu'on va s'arrêter là parce qu'il est déjà très tard. Merci beaucoup à tous. Et bonne continuation de ce festival au programme extrêmement riche. Merci.
Bye.